The world was locked in ice. Wind howled across empty plains of white, and the sky, heavy with clouds, pressed low against the earth. In the heart of this frozen silence, a small flicker of light trembled within a cave. A group of early humans, wrapped in animal skins, faces blackened with soot and fear, huddled close to the fire, their breath visible in the cold air. The fire crackled softly, their only heartbeat in a world that wanted them gone. Every sound outside, the crunch of shifting ice, the distant roar of a predator, was a reminder that the world belonged to the cold, and they were merely guests clinging to borrowed time. The Ice Age was not just a period of temperature. It was a test of existence. The Earth's warmth had retreated, glaciers carved their way through valleys, and the nights stretched endlessly, blurring time itself. For these ancient people, winter wasn't a season that came and went. It was the world's default state, a relentless presence. Days of dim light and nights of deep, bone-aching darkness forced them to change in ways no creature before them had. Every decision became a matter of survival. Where to find shelter, how to preserve heat, how to keep the fire alive when the air itself felt like an enemy. Inside their shelter, the firelight flickered across rough stone walls marked with the faint outlines of soot and scratches. Shadows danced, merging with the shapes of the people who sat around it. One figure fed the flames, another rubbed a small piece of flint against dry bark, while a third kept watch at the mouth of the cave, staring into the night. There was a rhythm to their silence, a quiet understanding among them that every spark, every moment of warmth was sacred. Yet even in this struggle, there was a mystery. Archaeologists today, studying ancient shelters like this one, have discovered something peculiar. No matter how small or large the space, there was always one spot left untouched. One corner of the shelter remained deliberately empty, as if it belonged to someone or something else. Why did they leave it that way? Was it superstition, fear, or wisdom beyond modern comprehension? Some believe it was a place for spirits, a boundary between the living and the unseen. Others think it was practical, perhaps a ventilation space for smoke or a cold air pocket to control temperature. But in this frozen dawn, before reason and ritual were distinct things, such divisions didn't exist. Every act of survival was both science and belief, instinct and reverence. The line between the physical and the spiritual was blurred by necessity. When the world outside was nothing but endless white death, anything unknown became sacred. Imagine that moment. The wind howling outside like a living thing, the cold pressing in through every crack of the stone, and a group of fragile humans forming a circle around a fire that could vanish with a single breath of wind. In that darkness, they were inventing the first meaning of home. The cave was more than shelter. It was their universe, their final defense against extinction. Every inch of it mattered. Where they slept, where they stored food, where they buried their ashes. And still, they left one space untouched. The empty spot stood as a silent witness to their awareness of limits. It said, "This is not ours to fill." The night deepened, and the fire began to fade. A woman placed another branch into the flames, watching as sparks danced upward and vanished. A child stirred beside her, half asleep, whispering something about lights in the snow. Outside, a predator's cry echoed across the frozen valley. The man at the entrance gripped his spear tighter, but did not move. Fear had become a familiar companion, no longer an emotion, but a condition of life. They did not speak of it. They didn't need to. The warmth of the fire, the closeness of bodies, the silence of the cave, all were words in a language older than speech. Far above, the stars shimmered through the haze, faint, distant, unreachable. To those inside the cave, they might as well have been the eyes of their ancestors watching from the sky. The world was not yet divided into myth and memory. Every glimmer of light had meaning. That empty corner, too, may have held its own quiet purpose, a space reserved for the unseen forces that shared their fragile existence. Perhaps it was a warning. Perhaps it was respect. Or perhaps it was the first gesture of humility. Humanity's recognition that survival depended not only on strength, but on the acceptance of mystery. When dawn came, the sun barely rose above the horizon. Its weak light spread across the snow, turning it a dull silver. The clan stirred, feeding the fire once more before stepping into the frozen air. They would go out to hunt, to gather, to endure. But before leaving, one of them glanced back at the empty spot in the corner of the cave. For a fleeting second, the sunlight caught on frost and made it glow. Then the fire crackled, and the glow faded. They turned away, and the cave swallowed their footprints in silence. In that brief, frozen dawn, the essence of humanity was born, not in triumph, but in endurance. The struggle against the cold, the instinct to protect warmth, and the strange reverence for what could not be understood, all of it shaped the story of who we are. The Ice Age did not just test humanity, it defined it. And in the empty corners of those ancient shelters, the echo of that definition still lingers, a silent mark left by the first hands that learned how to survive the dark. The Ice Age was not merely a chapter in Earth's history. It was a colossal transformation that shaped every mountain, every valley, and every living thing. The temperature of the planet dropped so drastically that even the seas began to freeze around their edges. Great sheets of ice, thicker than cities are tall, crept slowly across the continents. Forests that once teemed with life vanished beneath snow that never melted. The land became a world of mirrors, reflecting nothing but the colorless glow of a sun that offered no warmth. In this endless winter, survival became the most fragile and sacred art. Humanity stood on the knife's edge between existence and extinction. The world these early humans faced was unlike anything we can truly imagine. The glaciers that blanketed much of Europe and Asia created deserts of ice. No trees, no open water, only wind carving frozen plains. Food was scarce. The great herds of mammoths and bison moved like ghosts across the tundra, always migrating toward the faint promise of grass or thaw. To follow them meant crossing miles of emptiness, through storms that could strip flesh from bone. The hunters learned to read the patterns of wind and snow, to sense storms before they came, and to shelter when the sky turned gray with frozen dust. Each decision mattered. Each wrong step could cost an entire clan their lives. But nature's cruelty was not just physical, it was psychological. The cold didn't only numb their bodies, it numbed their sense of time and reality. Days blurred into nights that lasted for weeks. The horizon disappeared beneath the same white haze, making direction meaningless. People began to measure existence not in days, but in fires kept alive. A single glowing ember could become the difference between death and another sunrise. The Ice Age stripped humanity of comfort, forcing them to confront fear in its purest form, the fear of nature's indifference. There was no mercy in the wind, no compassion in the frost. And yet, this was the crucible in which humanity's resilience was forged. In this frozen world, predators also evolved to match the new extremes. Saber-toothed cats prowled the ice fields, wolves hunted in larger packs, and massive cave bears claimed the same shelters that humans needed. The cavemen were not the masters of their world. They were intruders, trespassing on land claimed by beasts far stronger and better adapted. Each time they left their shelter to hunt or fetch water, they risked crossing paths with these living nightmares. The cold was one enemy, but hunger and fear walked beside it. The line between predator and prey blurred. Survival meant becoming both. It was during this time that the human mind began to change. The relentless cold demanded planning, memory, and cooperation. Families could no longer live as scattered individuals. They became tribes bound by shared fire and shared fear. Those who learned to work together endured. Those who didn't vanished into the snow, leaving behind nothing but bones buried in ice. The Ice Age became the silent architect of society, teaching the first humans that strength was not found in solitude, but in unity. The firelight became more than warmth. It became the first form of civilization. Around it, language was born. Around it, stories began to grow. At night, when the wind screamed through the valleys, they would gather close and whisper legends into the darkness. Some said the cold had a spirit, a vast, unseen creature that moved across the sky, devouring warmth wherever it went. Others believed the stars were the souls of those who froze to death, looking down to guide the living away from danger. These early myths were not mere imagination. They were survival tools. Belief helped them endure what reason could not. If the storm was alive, then it could be pleaded with, respected, or avoided. It gave meaning to suffering, and meaning, in the end, was as vital as fire. Archaeologists studying Ice Age camps have found evidence of this blend of fear and adaptation. Tools crafted from stone and bone were made with precision that spoke of desperation and genius in equal measure. Hearths were positioned strategically within caves, often near entrances to balance smoke and warmth. Yet again, one pattern remains: the empty space. Even amid scarcity, they left one corner untouched. In an age where every scrap of warmth, every inch of shelter was precious, leaving a spot empty seems irrational. But to them, it was not. That emptiness represented respect for forces beyond control, a silent pact with a world that both threatened and sustained them. The Ice Age shaped more than their habits. It sculpted their bodies. Shorter limbs, broader chests, and layers of fat became natural armor against the chill. Their skin toughened, their eyes adjusted to dim light, and their instincts sharpened. But the greatest adaptation was invisible. It happened in the mind. They learned to anticipate change, to prepare for disaster, to plan for seasons long before they arrived. The brain became humanity's new tool, far more powerful than any spear or stone. And with intelligence came awareness, an understanding that survival was not guaranteed, and that every day lived was borrowed from a cold. Imagine the silence of that world. No bird song, no rustling trees, only wind and the creak of ice shifting in distant mountains. The earth seemed frozen in time, and humans were like sparks flickering against its endless stillness. Yet in that desolation, they endured. They hunted, built, loved, feared, and hoped. Every breath drawn into freezing lungs was an act of defiance. Every footprint in the snow was a statement. We are still here. This was the age when humanity was tempered, like steel in fire and frost. The age when endurance became identity. The cavemen did not conquer the cold. They learned to live beside it, to respect it, to find rhythm in its cruelty. From this long winter, our ancestors emerged harder, smarter, and forever changed. And within every shelter they built, one small, empty space stood as a reminder. A place untouched, perhaps left for the cold itself, a silent acknowledgement of the power that shaped them. The Ice Age may have been an era of fear, but it was also the beginning of everything that made us human. Shelter was more than just protection from the elements. It was a declaration of existence. In the heart of the Ice Age, when the wind could flay flesh and the darkness seemed endless, the act of creating a space between oneself and nature was an act of rebellion. The earliest humans learned that survival depended not only on the hunt or the fire, but on the ability to build boundaries, a fragile fortress against the vast, merciless cold. The cave became the first home, the first symbol of permanence in a world that offered none. Inside those stone walls, humanity began to carve out its identity, one layer of soot and smoke at a time. The earth provided what little safety it could. Natural caves were blessings, deep enough to hold warmth, narrow enough to keep predators at bay, and solid enough to withstand storms. Families and tribes claimed them like kingdoms. They dragged stones to block openings, hung animal skins to seal in heat, and lined the ground with dry grass to keep moisture away from their sleeping bodies. In open plains where caves were rare, they built shelters from mammoth bones, wooden branches, and hides stitched together with sinew. These bone huts, though crude, were masterpieces of necessity. Each one was designed with precision. The entrance facing away from the wind, the walls reinforced with snow, the fire pit carefully positioned to spread warmth without filling the space with smoke. Within these shelters, the rhythm of life took form. The interior was divided with a logic born of instinct. Near the entrance, the hunters kept tools, spears, and hides ready for sudden use. The fire burned at the center, surrounded by stones to hold heat long after the flames died. Behind it, the family rested, close enough to feel warmth but far enough to avoid the smoke that crawled upward toward the ceiling. And always, in nearly every excavated site, archaeologists find the same curious pattern. One part of the shelter left untouched, undisturbed. A patch of earth without soot, without artifacts, without footprints. An empty spot. The mystery of that space has puzzled researchers for generations. Was it simply coincidence, or was it intentional? In a world where every inch of warmth and security was precious, leaving a space unused makes no practical sense. Some scientists suggest it was a form of early ventilation, a place where cold air could settle to control the smoke. Others believe it was where tools or food were stored temporarily. Yet the absence of physical evidence, the untouched soil, the lack of debris, suggests something else entirely. It was a place of significance, perhaps sacred, perhaps feared. A space reserved not for the living, but for the unseen. Imagine the scene on a bitter night. Snow piles high outside the entrance, wind moaning through cracks in the stone. Inside, the fire burns low, the air thick with the smell of smoke and tanned hides. Children sleep near the back, curled beneath furs, while the adults whisper softly, voices barely louder than the crackle of flame. Every movement in the dark feels amplified. Every flicker of shadow on the wall seems alive. In that small circle of light, the humans feel both safe and trapped, protected by stone, yet surrounded by forces they cannot control. That empty spot in the corner becomes more than a gap. It becomes a boundary, a silent acknowledgement of what lies beyond the reach of firelight. For early humans, shelter was not only physical defense, but psychological sanctuary. It gave shape to the chaos outside and a sense of order within. Inside, time began to feel different, marked not by the rising of the sun, but by the feeding of the fire. The act of returning to the same shelter night after night created a rhythm, a sense of belonging. In that rhythm, humanity found the first faint echo of civilization. Around the hearth, they began to share stories, teach children, and plan the next hunt. The shelter became the center of existence, a microcosm of warmth in a universe of cold. The architecture of those early dwellings reveals the beginnings of thought, design, and foresight. The builders understood airflow, insulation, and structure long before they had words for them. They learned through experience that certain stones absorbed heat better, that fire pits burned steadier when surrounded by rock, that sealing cracks with animal fat could block drafts. Their homes were alive, changing with the seasons, adapting to storms, repaired after each struggle. Every shelter told a story of resilience written in soot, bone, and frost. And at the heart of each story was that same untouched space, a detail too deliberate to ignore. Perhaps the empty spot was a form of respect. Early humans might have believed that every cave had its own spirit, a guardian, a presence that granted safety in exchange for reverence. By leaving one part untouched, they offered it room to exist, to breathe alongside them. It was a silent pact. We take warmth and safety, and in return, we leave you peace. In later ages, this habit may have evolved into altars, sacred corners, and household shrines. But here, in the dim light of the Ice Age, it began simply as instinct, a feeling that survival required humility before the unknown. Outside, the storm would rage on for days, yet within those walls, life persisted. Fires were fed, tools sharpened, children born. In those fragile spaces, humanity endured the unendurable. Each shelter stood as a testament to defiance, a place where the weak overcame the impossible. But it was also a reminder of dependence, of how small they truly were against the frozen vastness beyond. The walls were their first armor, their fire the first weapon, and that untouched corner their first prayer. When the storms finally passed and they ventured out again, the shelters stood as monuments of hope against despair. Some would be abandoned, swallowed by snow, or reclaimed by beasts. Others would be found centuries later, preserved beneath layers of ice. And always, the same pattern remains. The center blackened by fire, the walls lined with the marks of human life, and in one corner, silence. A space never touched, never claimed, perhaps waiting for the return of those who once called it home. The shelter was not only a structure, it was the first reflection of the human mind, part protection, part mystery. It marked the moment when survival became something more than endurance. It became memory, belief, and creation. And in that empty space, the origins of spirituality and architecture intertwined. Humanity had learned to build walls, but also to leave room for the things they could not explain. Fire was not merely light or warmth. It was power, life, and the first form of control humanity ever held over nature. Before fire, the world belonged to the dark. The cold ruled every night, every breath, every choice. But when humans learned how to make and protect fire, they claimed something sacred. It was the moment the species became more than prey. It became the keeper of light in a world of shadows. In the depths of winter, when ice buried the land and predators prowled beyond the reach of sight, fire was the single barrier between life and oblivion. Every spark, every ember, was a victory against extinction. No one knows exactly when the first flame was tamed. Some say it began with lightning, a chance strike that set dry grass ablaze. Others imagine volcanic heat or friction-born spark from stone against stone. However it happened, the first humans who dared to approach the flames must have seen it as both terror and miracle. The fire consumed, yet it gave warmth. It destroyed, yet it protected. At first, it was something to fear, an unpredictable creature that roared and bit. But over time, through patience and pain, they learned to feed it, nurture it, and keep it alive. The day they carried embers from one camp to another marked the dawn of a new age. The moment humanity learned to carry its own sun. Inside their shelters, fire became the center of everything. It was never allowed to die. A single person, sometimes two, always stayed awake to guard it through the night. Sparks were preserved in hollowed bones or clumps of dry moss, smoldering through the dark until dawn. Around it, they ate, healed, and whispered their fears. The flickering light carved moving shadows across cave walls, giving life to drawings and stories that passed from generation to generation. It illuminated their faces and reminded them that they were still alive. Without it, the cave was just a tomb of stone. With it, it became a home. But fire did more than warm the body. It changed the mind. The glow of flames allowed for longer hours of thought, communication, and imagination. It forged community. Around its warmth, people learned to cooperate, to share food, to divide tasks. Firelight became the first classroom, the first temple, the first council hall. In that circle of heat, language flourished and culture began to breathe. The crackle of burning would become a rhythm that steadied human hearts against the chaos of the wild. For the first time, they had a way to push back the night, even if only a few steps at a time. Still, the fire was fragile. It needed constant feeding, constant attention. One mistake, a forgotten log, a sudden gust of wind, a spill of snow, and it could vanish. When it went out, panic followed. A dead fire meant a frozen camp, meat that couldn't be cooked, bones that couldn't be softened, and a night full of unseen predators. Losing fire was more than losing heat. It was losing hope. Some groups even treated fire as a living member of the tribe, with its own spirit and needs. To let it die was to offend it. To keep it burning was to honor it. The people began to pray to their flames in whispers, feeding them like gods. Archaeological evidence from Ice Age sites shows how carefully these fires were arranged. Stones were placed in tight circles, sometimes layered, to reflect heat inward. The ash pits were deep, designed to hold embers through the night. Smoke marks on cave ceilings suggest that fires were built in specific positions to control airflow, close enough to warm, but far enough to breathe. And once again, that same strange feature appears, an untouched space, often near the fire but not part of it. Some scientists suggest it acted as a vent where cold air settled, ensuring balance in temperature and oxygen. Others think it was spiritual, a place left empty for something unseen to share the warmth. The bond between humans and fire soon extended beyond survival. It transformed hunting, allowing meat to be cooked and preserved, hides to be hardened, tools to be reshaped. It lit the way during migration, keeping predators at a distance and spirits lifted. But even more importantly, it brought time itself under control. Before fire, night was an end. With fire, it became another kind of day, one filled with story, reflection, and creation. Around the flames, elders spoke of ancestors and spirits. Hunters recounted battles with mammoths and bears. Children learned to listen. And in that rhythm of light and darkness, something profound happened. Memory was born. Yet the power of fire also came with fear. The flames could turn on their masters. A spark could consume an entire camp, turning safety into destruction. The dual nature of fire mirrored the dual nature of life itself, nourishing and deadly, kind and cruel. To live with it required balance, respect, and vigilance. Perhaps that is why the empty corner of the shelter held such meaning. It was the place where control ended and reverence began. Humans could build walls and make fire, but there were still forces they dared not challenge completely. The empty space might have been a reminder, a quiet warning that power always carries its shadow. When dawn came, the fire would be reduced to glowing coals, red as blood in the pale light. Someone would kneel, breathe life back into the embers, and raise a new flame. That daily ritual, the act of resurrection, became one of the most important moments in human history. It was the beginning of continuity, of learning to pass knowledge and practice from one generation to the next. Fire became inheritance, the one possession that bound all humanity across time. Even now, tens of thousands of years later, the meaning of fire endures. We light candles in silence, gather around bonfires to tell stories, and stare into the glow of hearths for comfort. It is not instinct alone that draws us to flame, it is memory. The same ancient memory that once burned in a cave where the cold roared outside, where a handful of people sat close, guarding their light against the dark. In their eyes, reflected in that trembling glow, the first spark of civilization shimmered. Fire tamed the cold, but in truth, it also tamed us, teaching humanity that every gift of nature demands respect. And so they kept it burning, night after night, while in one untouched corner of their world, the darkness still watched in silence. Winter was not only a battle against the cold, but a war for food, and in that war, silence was the sharpest weapon. When snow buried the world, when rivers froze and herds vanished into the white horizon, the hunters became ghosts. Every breath was measured, every step calculated. The crunch of snow could mean failure or death. They wrapped their feet in layers of hide to soften their tread, smeared ash and mud on their skin to blur their scent, and moved with the patience of shadows. To hunt in winter was not merely about killing. It was about understanding the language of the frozen world, reading the wind, the trails, the silence itself. The prey of winter were fierce survivors, just like the hunters themselves. Mammoths moved in tight herds, their woolly forms like mountains in motion. Deer and elk grew lean and wary, knowing the slightest mistake could end their line. Even the wolves, their rivals in the hunt, grew bolder, sometimes following the same trails, testing the same herds. It was a constant dance between predator and prey, and in that dance, the line between them often blurred. When food was scarce, humans and wolves both became desperate, and sometimes they faced each other, not as enemies, but as equals of the same hunger. To prepare for these hunts, the tribe relied on ritual as much as skill. Before dawn, the hunters gathered near the fire, painting their bodies with symbols drawn from ash and blood. These markings were not decoration, they were belief. They carried the spirits of animals, granting strength, speed, or silence. The oldest among them whispered words into the flames, asking for guidance, asking the forest to open its secrets. Then they stepped out into the white, leaving the warmth behind. The first gust of wind that hit their faces was like a warning. Beyond the cave, there was no mercy. Weapons were crude, but deadly. Spears tipped with flint or bone, sometimes hardened by fire, were carried like extensions of the arm. The hunters worked together, moving in formations designed by experience and instinct. They learned to drive animals into traps, natural pits, frozen rivers, or steep slopes. When hunting larger beasts, they used fire and sound to corral them, torches raised high, shouting and beating the air with fear. Sometimes the hunt took days. They followed tracks through storms, over ice, through forests so still that even breath felt too loud. Hunger burned in their bellies, but purpose kept them moving. When a kill finally came, it was sacred. The air filled with steam and blood, and every member of the tribe understood its meaning. Nothing was wasted. The meat fed the living, the bones became tools, the hides turned into warmth. Even the tendons were stripped and dried for binding. The heart was often offered to the fire, a gift to the unseen spirits that watched their struggle. They believed the soul of the animal would return to the earth, and that its kin would not abandon them in future hunts. Survival was never just physical. It was spiritual balance, a pact written in blood and breath. But not every hunt ended in triumph. Sometimes, the prey escaped, and the hunters returned empty-handed. Sometimes, one of their own did not return at all. The snow would cover the trail, the silence would deepen, and the tribe would wait through the night, listening for footsteps that never came. When that happened, the survivors would leave a token, a piece of fur, a carved bone, or a flame lit at the edge of the cave. It was a way of saying that even in death, the hunter's spirit still moved with the wind. The empty space by the fire would stay unoccupied for a time, not out of fear, but out of respect. Over generations, hunting became not only survival, but identity. It shaped their minds, their tools, their stories. Every child grew up hearing tales of hunts, so dangerous they bordered on myth, of men who brought down beasts alone, of women who tracked prey through storms, of hunters who vanished into the white only to return with enough meat to save the tribe. These stories were told not just to remember the past, but to remind each generation of what was required to live. Bravery, patience, unity. These were the virtues carved into their hearts as deeply as the carvings on their cave walls. Winter demanded these qualities without mercy. One moment of weakness could end everything. A single misstep could send a hunter through the ice. A single noise could scatter a herd. And yet, despite it all, they went out again and again. It was not choice. It was necessity, written into their very blood. The cold taught them that fear was not something to escape, but something to master. And in mastering it, they learned what it meant to be human. The silent hunters were more than gatherers of food. They were guardians of the tribe's survival. Their courage in the white wasteland kept the fire burning, kept the children fed, kept hope alive. Every time they stepped into the snow, they carried the fate of everyone behind them. Theirs was a quiet heroism, without praise or glory. They returned not for honor, but for the sound of breathing in the cave, for the warmth of the fire that still lived because of them. And when they looked out into the blizzard and saw nothing but white, they knew they were not alone. The spirits of those who had fallen, the beasts they had hunted, the ancestors who had walked before, all were there, moving silently beside them through the endless cold. In a world where darkness came early and the cold could kill in a single night, fire was not just a tool. It was life itself. When the sun sank behind frozen hills, and the wind howled through the trees like a beast searching for prey, the flicker of flame became the line between existence and oblivion. To the cavemen, fire was both a miracle and a mystery. It was warmth, light, safety, and spirit. It breathed and danced and devoured, much like they did. Every ember was sacred, a living thing that demanded respect. The tribe gathered around it as if around a god, for in many ways it was one, the fire that had chosen them. Learning to make fire had changed everything. Before that discovery, they had been at the mercy of nature, taking what the earth gave and retreating from what it took away. But once they learned to create flame, to strike stone against stone, to coax a spark from dry grass, to breathe life into a smoldering ember, the balance shifted. Fire meant control. It meant they could cook what they killed, harden the tips of their spears, and keep the predators away at night. It meant they could survive the winter without constantly moving. In a world of constant change and danger, fire became the one constant they could trust. To start a fire in winter, however, was no simple task. Every spark was a battle. The dampness of snow, the frozen bark, the numbness of fingers, it all conspired against them. They carried dry moss and tinder in small pouches made from hide, protecting it like treasure. 2 stones, one of flint and the other of pyrite or quartz, were struck again and again until a faint glow appeared. Then, with patience and breath, they nurtured that glow into flame. The moment it caught, it was a small triumph against the vast indifference of nature. The first crackle of burning would sounded like hope itself. Once the fire was lit, it was never allowed to die. Even when the tribe moved, they carried embers wrapped in bark or within hollowed bones, ensuring that the spirit of the flame followed them wherever they went. Losing it meant risking death. Every tribe had 1 or 2 members, often women or elders, whose sole task was to guard the fire. They fed it, whispered to it, kept it alive when the storms came. In their eyes, it was not just warmth, but kin, a living member of the tribe. The fire's glow painted the walls of their shelters, casting moving shadows that became stories, myths, and warnings. Fire transformed not just their nights, but their minds. Around it, they began to speak more, to share thoughts that went beyond mere survival. The warmth loosened tongues and stirred imagination. The first stories may have been told beside these flames, tales of hunts, of spirits, of things unseen. The crackle of burning would mix with the rhythm of voices, and somewhere in that mix, the roots of human culture began to grow. It was at the fire's edge that ideas took form, where plans were made, songs were hummed, and fears were spoken aloud. Fire gave them light, but also gave them thought. It was also protection. The glow kept predators at bay. The wolves, the great cats, the hungry eyes watching from the dark. Animals feared the flame. They saw it as something unnatural, untouchable. The cavemen used that fear to their advantage, circling their shelters with small fires or carrying torches when venturing into the night. The flicker of firelight was a shield, invisible yet powerful. It gave them courage to step into the darkness and return alive. Without it, they were vulnerable, just another creature in the cold. With it, they became something more, masters of an element no beast could wield. Fire reshaped their diets as well. Cooking meat not only made it safer, but easier to chew and digest. The warmth of cooked food spread through their bodies like a second fire within, strengthening them against the cold. They began to experiment, roasting roots, smoking fish, boiling bones for broth. These simple acts were revolutionary. Nutrition improved, illness lessened, and with it came time to rest, to think, to dream. Fire had not only warmed their bodies, it had expanded their world. It gave them evenings of safety and mornings of renewal. Yet, fire was never to be taken lightly. It demanded constant attention. One careless act, one spark too close to dry grass, and it could turn against them, consuming their shelter and supplies in a single blaze. The elders taught the young to respect its dual nature, the warmth that saved and the heat that destroyed. They treated it like a spirit that must be appeased, fed with offerings of fat, wood, or bone. In some tribes, they believed that the flame's smoke carried messages to the ancestors, rising into the night sky where the stars listened. As winters came and went, the fire became the heartbeat of their existence. Around it, they planned hunts, healed wounds, and mourned their dead. When someone passed, their body was sometimes burned, not buried, so their spirit could rise with the smoke and join the stars. The fire consumed flesh but released essence. In that transformation, the cavemen saw a reflection of their own lives, brief sparks against the vast cold darkness of the Ice Age. Every ember told a story, every flicker carried memory. When they stared into the flames, they saw not just light, but lineage, the countless generations who had done the same before them. Fire was more than survival. It was connection. To lose, it was to lose everything they were. To keep it alive was to keep hope alive. And so, in every storm, through every night of unending snow, the cavemen gathered close, guarding their fire with their lives, whispering to it, believing that as long as it burned, they too would endure. When the world outside was buried under sheets of ice and howling winds tore through the plains, the cavemen turned to the art of shelter, a skill as vital as hunting or fire-making. In an age when cold could kill faster than hunger, a home was not just a place to rest, but a fortress against extinction. These early humans learned that survival began with walls, barriers that could block the wind, trap heat, and offer safety for both predators and the elements. Each shelter was a story written in stone, bone, and hide, shaped by the land and the wisdom of those who refused to surrender to the cold. The Ice Age tested every instinct they possessed, and through trial and endurance, they built sanctuaries that carried the promise of life. The first shelters were humble, carved from necessity. In the earliest days, caves served as nature's gift, a ready refuge from blizzards and beasts. The flicker of firelight within their depths turned cold darkness into warmth, echoing with the sound of crackling flames and soft breathing. Families would cluster together, wrapped in animal furs, as smoke curled upward and stories passed from elder to child. But caves were not always kind. Some were damp, filled with the stench of decay, or already claimed by predators like cave bears. To find one that was safe meant salvation. To lose one could mean death. Over time, humans began to shape the earth itself, carving alcoves, reinforcing walls with stones, and creating barriers at cave mouths to keep the warmth in and the danger out. What began as survival slowly evolved into craftsmanship, a dialogue between human ingenuity and the raw elements of nature. Yet not all tribes had caves to rely on. Many roamed open tundras or forested plains where stone walls did not exist. These nomadic clans turned to bones, the remains of the great beasts they hunted. Mammoth ribs became archways, skulls became walls, and hides became roofs. A single mammoth could provide not just food and tools, but the skeleton of a home. The construction of a bone shelter required strength, patience, and vision. Large bones were driven into the frozen ground, lashed together with sinew and rope made from twisted fibers. The gaps were filled with moss, grass, and packed snow to seal out the cold. Over this frame, layers of animal hide were stretched tight, creating a warm cocoon amid the frozen world. When fire burned within, the interior glowed like a heartbeat, life pulsing in defiance of death. These shelters stood as proof of humankind's adaptability, a blend of brutality and brilliance born from desperation. Inside these shelters, warmth was more than physical, it was emotional. The space became the center of family, connection, and memory. The walls, though rough and primitive, held the laughter of children and the whispers of parents planning the next hunt. In those moments, surrounded by fur and firelight, humanity took its first steps toward what we now call home. It was not luxury, but belonging, a shared protection against the merciless cold. The fire's smoke darkened the ceilings, and bones hung as tools and trophies, each carrying its own tale of struggle and triumph. Outside, the wind screamed across the ice. Inside, the world was small, fragile, and filled with warmth. These shelters became the womb of civilization, places where ideas, language, and compassion were quietly nurtured. Building such dwellings demanded not only physical effort, but also knowledge of the environment. The cavemen studied the wind, the angle of sunlight, and the patterns of the snow. They learned to place their shelters near water but far from flood zones, near forests for wood, but high enough to avoid predators. They understood insulation before the word even existed, layering materials, creating double walls, and designing entrances that curved to block wind. Some even built community clusters, with several shelters arranged around a central fire pit, allowing shared warmth and protection. These clusters formed the earliest villages, where survival transformed into social connection. The bond between people and place deepened, laying the foundation for the first human settlements. Still, the threat of collapse or exposure was ever present. A storm could rip apart a hide roof in minutes. An animal attack could shatter the illusion of safety. Rebuilding became a constant cycle, an act of resilience repeated generation after generation. Each reconstruction was an improvement, a small step forward in understanding how to fight nature with knowledge. Through this repetition, early humans honed their engineering instincts. They began using stone rings to anchor structures, discovering the insulating power of snow walls, and even experimenting with underground burrows. Every adaptation was born of observation and necessity, and every success carried the memory of past failure. To the cavemen, a shelter was not merely a structure, it was a living symbol of hope. In the vast, frozen silence of the Ice Age, it was the one place where warmth and humanity gathered together. Outside lay darkness, hunger, and death. Inside flickered light, food, and the murmur of voices. These shelters were the first architecture of emotion, built not just to protect bodies but to preserve souls. They were the wombs of survival, where love, fear, and memory intertwined beneath the crackling song of fire. In time, the skills that began with bones and hides would evolve into huts, cabins, and houses, but the essence remained unchanged, the human need to create space against chaos. The shelters of the Ice Age were the first blueprints of civilization, drawn not on paper, but in the frost and blood of endurance. And though millennia have passed, the instinct they represent still burns within us. The eternal desire to find warmth, to build safety, and to turn wilderness into home. In that primal act of shelter building, humanity declared its quiet rebellion against extinction and won. When the winds of the Ice Age screamed across the plains, tearing at the skin and freezing the breath in their throats, shelter became more than a place to sleep. It was the difference between life and death. The cavemen understood this truth intimately. Their homes were not built for comfort. They were carved from necessity, shaped by hands that knew the cold too well. Each shelter was a fortress against winter's cruelty, a fragile bubble of warmth amid an ocean of ice. In these spaces of flickering light and whispered breath, humanity learned to endure. Their shelters took many forms, adapted to the land and the materials at hand. Some tribes found refuge in caves, the ancient mouths of the earth that swallowed wind and snow alike. The walls were cold and damp, but solid, safe. Inside, they built fires near the center, letting smoke curl upward and escape through cracks and crevices. The air grew thick and warm, scented with wood and animal fat. Others, especially those who lived on open tundra where caves were rare, built their homes from what they could gather: mammoth bones, branches, hides, and snow. The great ribs of fallen beasts became archways, the hides stretched tight across frames to block the wind, and snow itself, packed thick, served as insulation, trapping heat within. Each shelter was a reflection of ingenuity. They learned to use layers, animal skins over frames, moss stuffed into cracks, and sometimes even clay mixed with straw to harden against the wind. Entrances were kept low and narrow to preserve warmth, and fires were built in shallow pits lined with stone. Smoke holes were covered with thin hides that could be moved aside to let air in and out. The walls glowed orange when the flames inside burned bright, and from a distance, the faint shimmer of light in the dark signaled life, a rare sight in the frozen wilderness. Inside, space was sacred. Families slept close together, sharing body heat beneath layers of fur and hide. The fire occupied the center, its warmth radiating outward, a living heart around which everything revolved. Tools hung from the walls, stone blades, bone needles, spears. Dried meat dangled overhead, safe from scavengers. The floor was covered with layers of grass, bark, and skins to keep the cold earth from stealing their warmth. It was simple, but to them, it was a sanctuary. The moment they stepped inside from the storm, they could feel life returning to their fingers and faces. The shelter was not just structure, it was salvation. These shelters also held stories. The walls of caves, smooth and timeless, became their first canvases. With pigments made from crushed minerals, charcoal, and animal fat, they painted their world, the hunts, the animals, the spirits. The flickering light of the fire made the figures seem to move, turning still images into living memory. Perhaps it was art, or perhaps it was prayer, a way to make sense of the vast, merciless wilderness outside. Every mark told a story of survival, of gratitude, of the bond between man and nature. In the silence of winter nights, these paintings spoke more clearly than words ever could. But not all shelters were static. Some tribes moved often, following herds or seeking better land. Their homes had to be portable, built quickly, and abandoned without regret. For them, speed mattered as much as warmth. They carried poles and hides, setting up small domes or lean-tos that could be assembled within hours. Fires were lit at the center, and stones heated during the day were brought inside at night to extend the warmth. They slept in shifts, one always awake to tend the flame. Every night was a gamble against the cold, every dawn a small miracle. To the cavemen, building shelter was an act of trust in their own endurance. They worked as families, men shaping frames, women sewing hides, children gathering moss and wood. Even the smallest hands contributed, for in that world, survival demanded unity. When storms came, they would huddle inside, listening to the wind batter the walls, the sound of snow piling higher. Outside, the world turned white and wild. Inside, the crackle of fire and the murmur of voices created a fragile sense of peace. The contrast between the storm and their stillness became the rhythm of their lives. There was also symbolism in how they arranged their shelters. Many left one spot empty, a small corner near the entrance or a blank patch of wall. It was not for storage or sleep. It was for the unseen. They believed that the spirits of their ancestors, or perhaps the spirits of the animals they hunted, needed space to enter and watch over them. To fill that space would be to invite misfortune, to anger the forces that govern the cold. So they left it untouched, an invisible doorway between worlds. The wind might whistle through it, or the shadows might seem to move, but to them, that was not fear. It was presence. As time passed, their shelters evolved with their minds. They began to decorate more, to carve symbols into bones that framed the walls, to arrange stones in patterns that meant something only to them. Each tribe developed its own ways, its own small architectural language. And while every home was temporary, the knowledge of building endured. Parents taught children which materials kept warmth best, how to place a fire without smoke choking the air, how to recognize a safe cave by the scent of dry stone. These lessons were survival encoded into memory, passed on like stories and songs. The shelters of stone and bone were more than mere structures. They were the birthplace of human resilience. They represented the first step toward civilization, the first assertion that mankind could shape the world to its needs rather than bowing before it. Each wall, each layer of hide, each stone placed against the wind was a declaration of defiance against extinction. And when the night outside howled with frost and darkness, and the fire inside painted the walls with living light, the cavemen must have felt, even if only for a moment, that they had conquered the impossible. Inside those fragile shelters, humanity learned what it meant not just to survive, but to belong. In the unyielding cold of the Ice Age, family was not just love, it was survival. Every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of warmth was shared, and in that sharing, humanity found its greatest strength. The cavemen did not live as isolated beings, but as tightly bound units, linked by blood, fire, and need. Each shelter was a microcosm of their world, a circle of faces illuminated by firelight, each life dependent on the others. To be alone was to be lost, for the cold had no mercy for solitude. Family, in that frozen wilderness, was the fire that burned even when the wood ran low. Their families were not like the modern ones we know. They were tribes, clusters of kin and allies, bound less by formality and more by instinct. At their core were the elders, the living archives of memory. Their eyes had seen countless winters, and their words carried the weight of experience. They remembered how to track herds, where to find shelter, how to read the sky. The younger ones listened in silence, memorizing every detail, for forgetting was dangerous. In their world, knowledge was not power. It was survival currency, passed down through stories told beside the fire when the storms howled outside. The men and women of the tribe had different roles, but neither was lesser. The hunters risked their lives beyond the safety of the fire, venturing into blizzards in pursuit of beasts that could crush or devour them. The women, equally vital, kept the fire alive, cared for the children, prepared the hides, cooked, and cured meat for preservation. They also tended to the wounded, turning herbs and bones into medicines. Every role flowed into the next. There was no hierarchy, only necessity. Their unity was born not from order, but from understanding. Each person was a thread in the fragile web of survival. Children were at the heart of the tribe, not just as heirs, but as living hope. Their laughter broke the monotony of long winters. Their curiosity mirrored the tribe's will to continue. They learned through watching, mimicking the motions of skinning, weaving, and carving. A boy's first successful hunt or a girl's first sewn hide was celebrated with quiet pride. These moments were not small. They were proof that life would go on, that knowledge would not die in the snow. The tribe protected its young fiercely, not out of sentimentality, but because each child was a promise to the future. Inside the shelters, family bonds deepened with every hardship shared. At night, they slept close, bodies pressed together beneath layers of fur, sharing warmth that no fire could match. They listened to the world outside, the distant howl of wolves, the hiss of falling snow, and drew strength from one another's presence. The fire's glow flickered across faces young and old, revealing the unspoken truth that had carried humanity through eons. Survival was not an individual triumph, but a collective act. In that tight embrace of kinship, they found comfort against the vast, uncaring night. Conflict, of course, was not absent. In times of scarcity, tensions simmered. When food ran low or a hunt failed, tempers flared, voices rose. But even anger was brief, burned out by necessity. They could not afford division. The cold punished isolation, forcing reconciliation. Disputes were settled through shared labor, through the act of doing rather than speaking. Cooperation was not a moral choice, it was instinct. The tribe that fractured did not last long. The snow buried both pride and pain equally. Forgiveness, in that sense, was not virtue but strategy, learned from the relentless lessons of nature. Beyond blood, there were bonds of friendship and ritual kinship. Orphans, wanderers, and survivors from other tribes were sometimes taken in, bound by fire rather than lineage. The act of sharing warmth, food, and shelter forged ties as strong as blood. Around the fire, they told stories of ancestors and spirits, but they also built new ones, stories of the present, of shared hunts and shared fears. These narratives stitched their lives together, creating a web of belonging that extended beyond mere survival. In a world of danger, the feeling of us was a fortress no storm could breach. Love, too, existed, though it wore a simpler form. It was seen in a shared meal, in a fur draped over another's shoulders, in hands reaching out to mend wounds. Romantic love was not spoken of in words, but shown through acts of care. Hunting for a partner's meal, tending a fire late into the night, or defending one another from harm. Birth and death, joy and loss, all unfolded within the same circle of warmth. When someone died, their absence was felt in every corner of the shelter. A quiet space by the fire was left empty for days, a symbol of remembrance. The tribe grieved together, for every death was a shared wound. And yet, despite grief, life always continued. Babies were born even in the coldest winters, their first cries mingling with the crackle of the fire. The tribe would gather close, wrapping the infant in hides, the mother's face shining with exhaustion and hope. These moments, fragile and fleeting, reminded them of what they were fighting for. Each new life was a defiance, a spark of warmth against the infinite cold. The elders would whisper blessings, invoking the spirits of ancestors to protect the newborn, to let the fire of life burn on. The bonds of blood and fire were not only physical, they were spiritual. The tribe believed their ancestors watched over them, that every flicker of flame carried the presence of those who came before. When the fire crackled unexpectedly, they said it was the voice of the departed. When the wind whispered through the shelter, they heard guidance in its sound. This faith tied them to one another even more deeply. The living and the dead shared the same circle of warmth, bound by unseen threads of memory and devotion. Through countless winters, it was these bonds that kept them alive. Not the sharpness of their tools or the strength of their arms, but the unity of their hearts. Each act of kindness, each shared flame, each meal divided fairly kept the tribe from fracturing into despair. The cold could freeze flesh, but it could not touch the warmth of connection. And when the dawn broke after another long, merciless night, and the first rays of pale sunlight touched their faces, they knew they had survived not because of their strength, but because of each other. When the great cold finally began to loosen its grip, the world that emerged was both strange and familiar. The glaciers that had once towered like silent gods began to melt, feeding rivers that carved new paths through the earth. Forests spread where once there had been only snow, and animals returned to graze upon thawing plains. Yet the memory of the long winter lived on in the hearts of those who had endured it. For generations, the descendants of the cave dwellers carried within them the knowledge and instincts forged in ice and hunger. The fire that once flickered inside dark shelters now burned in their minds, a symbol of human persistence, passed down like an unbroken torch. The endless winter had changed more than just the land. It had reshaped humanity itself. Those who survived had learned lessons that no warmth could erase. They had mastered patience, endurance, and cooperation. They knew that life was fragile and that survival demanded unity. Even as the seasons grew gentler and the days longer, the old instincts remained. Families still gathered close at night. Fires still burned at the heart of every home, and stories of the Great Cold were told to children as both warning and wonder. The past had become a myth, but a myth rooted in truth, a reminder that humanity's strength was born not in comfort, but in struggle. The tools they had once used to carve through bone and ice evolved into instruments of creation. Stones were shaped with precision, bones polished into art, and hides transformed into garments not just for warmth but for beauty. The skills that once kept them alive became the foundation of culture. The act of survival turned into the act of living. From cave walls painted with hunts and dreams emerged the first expressions of human imagination. What began as instinct became tradition, and what began as necessity became innovation. The fire of survival had become the spark of civilization. But even as the world thawed, the lessons of the cold were never forgotten. The people remembered the silence of the frozen nights, the hunger that gnawed at their stomachs, and the way they had depended on one another to endure. That memory lived on in the way they treated the earth, with respect, fear, and gratitude. They had learned that nature could be both provider and destroyer, generous and merciless. The winter had been their greatest teacher, showing them that strength without wisdom was meaningless. To live in balance with the land became a sacred duty, passed down like a moral code etched in their very blood. Generations later, as tribes spread across the warming world, their descendants carried traces of that ancient resilience. Some settled near rivers, others in forests or grasslands, but all bore the same quiet strength. They built homes, crafted tools, and raised families beneath skies that no longer threatened snow at every turn. Yet when the winds howled or storms came, they would huddle together by the fire and feel, somewhere deep inside, the echo of their ancestors' fear and their courage. That memory gave them purpose, a silent understanding that survival was never guaranteed, but always earned. The endless winter had also shaped the way they viewed death and life. In the frozen age, every breath had been a battle, and each death had carried meaning. They came to see life as a fragile flame that must be protected. When someone died, it was said that their warmth returned to the earth, feeding the fire that kept the living alive. This belief endured long after the cold had gone. The people honored their dead not with monuments, but with fire, lighting torches and hearths in remembrance, whispering names into the smoke as it rose toward the sky. In this way, the spirits of the lost became part of the living world, an eternal circle born from the chill of death and the glow of life. The old stories, too, lived on, legends of great hunts, of monstrous beasts, and of the first flames that refused to die. The children listened wide-eyed as the elders spoke of a time when the sun itself seemed to vanish and only human courage kept the world alive. These tales became more than memories. They became the foundation of identity. They taught the young that survival was not just about strength, but about heart, will, and the fire within. Even as generations passed and the earth grew fertile again, the echoes of that age continued to shape who they were. Humanity, born from ice and endurance, never truly forgot where it came from. And so, the legacy of the endless winter lived on, not as suffering, but as wisdom. It taught them that warmth is precious only because of the cold, that light means nothing without darkness, and that every act of survival carries within it the seed of creation. The caves that once sheltered them became sacred places, reminders of their humble beginnings. Some returned to these old homes, not to live but to remember. They left carvings, offerings, and marks of gratitude upon the stone, as if thanking the earth itself for sparing them. In those silent chambers, humanity's first chapter remained carved into eternity. Even in the modern world that would come long after, the same instincts would endure. People would still gather around firelight, still find comfort in closeness, still tell stories to drive back the darkness. The tools might change, the shelters might rise higher, but the essence remained unchanged. Beneath all the progress and pride, humans would still carry the memory of that frozen struggle, the proof that they had faced extinction and triumphed. The endless winter had not just tested them, it had defined them. It had taught them that no matter how deep the darkness, the flame of life would always find a way to burn. In the end, that was the true gift of the Ice Age, the knowledge that warmth is not merely heat, but connection. That to survive is to remember, and to remember is to honor the fire that once saved them. The snow may have melted, but its lessons remained eternal. The endless winter had forged the first humans into more than mere survivors. It had turned them into storytellers, dreamers, and builders of worlds. From the ashes of ice, they rose, not just alive, but awakened, carrying the legacy of fire into every dawn that followed. Among all the forces that shaped early humanity, none were as sacred or as powerful as fire. For the cavemen, fire was more than a discovery. It was a companion, a protector, and a living spirit that stood between life and death. In the frozen nights of prehistory, when the wind screamed like a beast and the darkness seemed endless, fire became the only light that kept despair at bay. The first sparks, born from stone and friction, marked the moment when humans began to command nature rather than fear it. Around the flickering glow of flames, the story of civilization quietly began. Fire offered warmth when the world froze, safety when predators prowled, and hope when the stars seemed too far away. At first, fire must have seemed like a miracle. Early humans likely encountered it after lightning struck trees or lava spilled from the Earth's wounds. To approach, it was to face both terror and wonder. The heat could burn flesh as easily as it warmed it. Yet slowly, curiosity conquered fear. They learned to carry embers wrapped in bark, to protect them through storms and migrations. Each tribe guarded its fire like a living treasure. Losing it meant starting over, facing cold, darkness, and death. Fire became a symbol of survival itself, a fragile flame that mirrored their own existence, beautiful, dangerous, and easily extinguished. Learning to create fire was humanity's greatest leap. With stones that sparked or wooden bows that spun heat into smoke, early humans learned not just to find fire, but to summon it. This power transformed everything. Food that had once been raw and tough became tender and safe to eat. Fire made bones crack open to reveal rich marrow, turned bitter roots into meals, and smoked meats that lasted through long winters. It was a tool that unlocked energy hidden within nature, feeding both body and mind. Around the hearth, the tribe grew stronger, not just in health, but in unity. The flame became the center of life, its circle of light defining the limits of the human world. Fire changed the night itself. Before it, darkness had ruled unbroken. The shadows beyond the cave entrance were home to predators and spirits, a place no human dared to walk. But with fire, the cavemen extended their dominion into the hours of night. They no longer feared the howls beyond the trees. The flicker of flame pushed back the wild and replaced fear with calm. Within that warm circle, people found time to rest, to speak, to dream. They told stories of hunts, of gods, and of ancestors who had first tamed the spark. Fire gave them not just safety, but imagination. It turned survival into reflection, and reflection into memory. The fire also became a teacher of discipline. To keep it alive required patience and care. Too little fuel, and it died. Too much, and it raged uncontrollably. Children learned early the rhythm of tending it. The slow feeding of branches, the gentle stirring of ash, the quiet listening to its breath. Fire demanded respect. It punished recklessness and rewarded balance. In this, it mirrored nature itself. From it, early humans learned the first lessons of responsibility, that survival came not from domination, but from harmony with the forces around them. As winters deepened, fire became their only true guardian. It dried their hides, thawed their frozen fingers, and kept the frost from claiming their breath. When storms buried the land in snow and the caves grew colder, they built their lives around its warmth. Every hearth was a heart, every flame a pulse. Families gathered close, faces glowing in orange light, watching the dance of heat that reminded them of life itself. The crackle of burning would become a lullaby against the wind, the scent of smoke a comfort that meant safety. Without fire, there was no survival, only silence and cold. But beyond its physical uses, fire awakened something deeper. The cavemen began to see it as a sacred presence, perhaps even alive. Its movements were unpredictable, its hunger constant, its glow mesmerizing. They believed it held the spirit of ancestors or gods, and that tending it was a ritual act. Fire was not owned, it was honored. Some tribes placed stones around it in patterns, whispering prayers as they added wood. Others believed that letting the flame die invited misfortune. The oldest among them were often keepers of the fire, its guardians through night and storm. It was their duty to protect the spark that symbolized life itself. Through fire, they discovered new ways to shape their world. Heat hardened their spear tips, cured animal skins, and baked clay into vessels. It allowed them to craft tools more durable and precise. It became a bridge between the physical and the spiritual, between survival and creation. The same force that cooked their food also helped them create art, torches that lit cave walls so they could paint their stories, shadows dancing as if alive. Fire transformed caves into cathedrals of memory. Each flicker illuminated drawings of hunts and dreams, keeping alive the tales of who they were and what they feared. Yet, fire also reminded them of danger. A single spark could consume an entire shelter, turning safety into ruin. The same warmth that saved them could destroy everything if disrespected. This duality fascinated them. Fire was both a friend and a destroyer, a creator and a killer. They learned to fear it even as they cherished it. In their myths, it became a gift from the gods, stolen or earned through great trials. It was the line between the human and the divine. And perhaps, in some quiet corner of their hearts, they knew that as long as fire burned, humanity would endure. Generations later, when their descendants roamed farther and built greater things, the reverence for fire remained. From hearths to forges, from torches to temples, the flame never lost its sacred place. It was carried across continents and through ages, a constant thread linking all people to their earliest ancestors. Fire became the symbol of knowledge, of spirit, of life itself. To this day, its glow draws us together just as it did those first humans huddled in the cold. The cavemen may be gone, but the fire they kept alive still burns. In our homes, in our rituals, in the restless human heart that refuses to surrender to the dark. When the cold winds of the Ice Age tore through the valleys and the snow fell so heavily that even the sun seemed to disappear, the cavemen understood that only one thing stood between them and death: shelter. It was not just a roof of stone or a wall of branches. It was the boundary between existence and extinction. Building a home in that frozen world was an act of defiance against nature itself. Every structure they built, no matter how small or crude, was a statement that they refused to be erased by the cold. To survive the endless winter, they became architects of necessity, shaping the earth and stone into sanctuaries that could hold both body and spirit. At first, their shelters were simple, shallow caves chosen for their warmth and protection. The rock walls shielded them from the wind, and the earth beneath their feet retained the faint memory of heat. But as the climate grew harsher and tribes moved into open plains where caves were scarce, they adapted. They learned to build with what the land offered: mammoth bones, hides, branches, and packed snow. Each material told a story of resourcefulness. Mammoth ribs became arching frames. Hides stretched over them to block the icy gusts, and snow itself was shaped into domes that trapped warmth inside. These primitive dwellings were more than shelters. They were masterpieces of survival engineering. Inside, the space was carefully planned. Fire always took the center, its light flickering against walls that glowed like amber. Around it, families slept close together, wrapped in furs and pressed against one another for warmth. Every inch of space was sacred, one side reserved for tools, another for food, another for rest. Entrances were often low and narrow, designed to keep the wind from rushing in. The smallest details mattered because mistakes could cost lives. In that world, architecture was not about comfort. It was about endurance. To build was to live another day. The cavemen also learned the art of insulation. They packed gaps in their shelters with moss, grass, or mud, sealing out drafts and conserving every bit of heat the fire could provide. In snow-covered lands, they used the very cold to their advantage, building thick walls of ice that, paradoxically, kept the warmth inside. When the world outside froze solid, their homes became warm bubbles of life. Each shelter was like a heartbeat pulsing within the endless white, a fragile but determined reminder that humanity had found a way to adapt to even the cruelest of seasons. Shelters were not merely structures, they were emotional sanctuaries. In the darkness of winter, when howls echoed from beyond the trees and death felt close, these small enclosures offered a sense of belonging and safety. The moment one stepped inside, the roar of the storm dulled, and the smell of smoke, hides, and cooked meat filled the air. Here, laughter could return, even if just for a moment. Parents whispered stories to their children. Elders tended the fire and shared wisdom from colder times. The home became more than a shelter from weather. It was a fortress against despair. Over time, the act of building evolved into a ritual. When a new shelter was constructed, it was often blessed with gestures or markings meant to invite protection. Some tribes left a small space, an intentional gap in the wall or roof, believing it allowed spirits or ancestors to watch over them. To the modern eye, it might seem like superstition, but for them it was balance. They had learned that survival depended not just on strength or skill, but on respect for unseen forces. In their minds, a home was alive, it breathed, it listened, and it connected them to the earth. Every shelter also carried the memory of the land. The materials came from the world around them, the bones of animals they hunted, the branches from trees that shaded their paths, the mud from rivers that sustained them. To build a home was to weave oneself into the fabric of nature. And when they moved on, they often left the structure behind, letting it return to the elements. The wind would strip away the hides, the snow would collapse the frame, and the earth would reclaim what it had given. It was the circle of life and death mirrored in wood and stone. The skill of shelter building passed down through generations, improving with every season of hardship. Children learned by watching their elders tie sinew, anchor bones, and seal cracks. Each generation refined the craft, discovering new ways to conserve heat or withstand storms. Eventually, their knowledge became instinct, a deep understanding of how to read the land. They knew which direction the wind would strike, where the snow would drift, and how to place their shelters to catch the warmth of the morning sun. It was wisdom written not in words, but in survival. For the cavemen, building was also an expression of community. A single person could not raise a shelter alone. It took many hands, some gathering materials, others lifting, binding, or sealing. The process strengthened their bonds. In those shared moments, they were reminded that survival was never solitary. The fire inside the finished shelter burned not just because of one person's effort, but because of the tribe's unity. When the storms came, they huddled together inside, listening to the wind batter their walls, knowing that what they had built together was stronger than the world outside. As time went on, the shelters grew more sophisticated. Some tribes built semi-subterranean homes, digging into the ground to harness the earth's natural warmth. Others stacked stones with remarkable precision, creating chambers that could last through generations. These innovations were quiet revolutions, steps toward the future cities and civilizations that would one day rise. The instinct to build, to carve safety from chaos, began here in the frozen age, beneath the weight of endless snow. The cavemen may not have known it, but every wall they built was a blueprint for humanity's future. In the end, the shelters of the Ice Age were more than just protection from cold. They were symbols of resilience. Each one told the same story, the story of a species that refused to surrender. When the winds howled and the world seemed intent on erasing them, the cavemen answered with walls of bone and skin, with the steady glow of fire, with courage carved into every beam and stone. In those shelters, humanity learned not only how to survive nature, but how to coexist with it. And though the shelters themselves have long vanished, buried under centuries of earth and time, their spirit endures. In every home we build, in every hearth we light, and in every effort we make to keep the darkness outside at bay. In the vast and merciless expanse of the Ice Age, hunting was not just a skill, it was the pulse of existence. Every breath the cavemen took, every journey they made, revolved around one eternal truth. Without the hunt, there was no life. Food was not guaranteed. It was earned through courage, patience, and unity. The frozen landscape offered little mercy. Vegetation was scarce, and the animals they pursued were colossal, powerful, and deadly. Yet the cavemen stood against them, armed only with sharpened stone, wooden spears, and an unyielding will to survive. Hunting in the frozen world was not merely an act of survival. It was a sacred dance between man, beast, and nature. The Ice Age was home to creatures that would later vanish in a legend. Mammoths that towered like living mountains, woolly rhinoceroses that charged like storms, and saber-toothed cats that prowled the edges of the firelight. Each hunt demanded strategy and respect. To face such giants required more than strength. It required understanding. The cavemen observed their prey, learning their paths, behaviors, and weaknesses. They studied the winds to mask their scent and used the land to their advantage, herding animals toward traps or cliffs. Every successful hunt was a masterpiece of planning, teamwork, and silent communication. One wrong step could turn hunter into hunted. Weapons were extensions of their instincts. Early spears were tipped with flint, carefully chipped into razor edges, then hardened in fire to pierce thick hides. Some tribes developed atlatls, throwing sticks that increased the speed and distance of their spears. Others used pits, snares, and ambushes to catch smaller game. But even with these tools, the hunt was brutal and uncertain. The cavemen knew the cost of failure: hunger, weakness, and death. And so, every hunt was approached with reverence. Before setting out, elders whispered blessings, and fires were lit to seek favor from the spirits of the land. They believed that every animal had a soul, and that taking its life required gratitude and humility. The hunters moved through the snow in silence, wrapped in furs that blended with the white world around them. Their breath steamed in the air, their footprints shallow and deliberate. When they tracked herds, they read signs that others might overlook: the faint imprint of hooves, the scatter of dung, the direction of broken branches. To them, the landscape was a living map, every mark a word in the language of survival. For days, sometimes weeks, they followed the trails across icy plains and through frozen valleys. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, but determination drove them forward. Each step was a promise, to their families, to their tribe, to the fire waiting back home. When the moment came, it was swift and violent. The air filled with the sound of shouts, pounding hooves, and the whistling of spears. The hunters surrounded their prey, hearts pounding as they faced the raw power of nature. To bring down a mammoth was to face death itself. It took coordination, courage, and sacrifice. Sometimes the hunt claimed lives as well as gave them. Yet when the beast finally fell, its collapse echoed like thunder, a sound of victory that filled every heart with awe and relief. The tribe rejoiced, not with arrogance, but with respect. They approached the fallen creature in silence, touching its hide and offering thanks for the life it had given. The reward of a successful hunt was life renewed. Every part of the animal was used: meat for food, fat for fuel, bones for tools, sinew for bindings, and hides for warmth. Nothing was wasted. Around the fire, they roasted cuts of meat, the scent filling the cave with a promise of strength. Children watched in wonder as elders carved new tools from the bones, teaching them the sacred balance of taking and giving. The hunt fed not only their bodies, but their spirits. It connected them to the rhythm of the world, the endless cycle of death and renewal that defined existence. In the long winters when game was scarce, they turned to smaller prey: hares, birds, and fish trapped beneath the ice. They crafted delicate bone hooks, wove nets from sinew, and set traps along riverbanks. These quiet hunts demanded patience rather than power. They sat for hours, motionless, their eyes fixed on the smallest movements. Every catch, no matter how small, was celebrated. In a world where hunger was constant, even a single fish could mean survival. These humble victories taught them gratitude and persistence, lessons that shaped the human spirit across millennia. The hunters also faced rivals, predators that stalked the same prey. Packs of wolves, saber-toothed cats, and cave lions haunted the peripheries of their camps. Sometimes, competition turned into confrontation. A wolf pack might descend upon a carcass the hunters had worked days to bring down, forcing them to fight tooth and claw for their share. The cavemen learned to watch the wild with both admiration and wariness. They understood that they were part of nature's order, not above it. Every hunt reminded them that they were neither the strongest nor the fastest, but they were the most determined. Hunting was not only about survival, it was about identity. The success of a hunt defined the strength of a tribe, the courage of its men, and the wisdom of its leaders. Around a fire, tales of great hunts became legend. They spoke of heroes who faced mammoths alone, of women who saved the tribe by tracking food through storms, of hunts where the fire itself seemed to guide their path. These stories passed from generation to generation, shaping their culture and sense of purpose. To hunt was to live with honor, to face the wild with respect and bravery. It was both necessity and art, struggle and celebration. When the Ice Age finally loosened its hold and the great beasts began to vanish, the cavemen adapted once again. They hunted smaller game, learned to fish more efficiently, and began to gather from the land. But the spirit of the hunt never died. It lived on in their blood, in their stories, and in the way they faced every new challenge, with the same patience, cunning, and unity that had carried them through the frozen age. Hunting had shaped them into thinkers, strategists, and dreamers. It had taught them that survival was not about dominance, but about balance and respect. Even now, thousands of years later, the echo of those hunts lingers in the human soul. The thrill of pursuit, the satisfaction of success, and the bond between people who work together toward a common goal, all are remnants of that ancient world. The cavemen hunted for food, but they also hunted for meaning, for connection, for proof that they belonged in a world that tried to erase them. In the frozen silence of the Ice Age, their courage carved the first paths towards civilization. Each hunt, each step, and each firelit feast was a reminder that humanity was born not from comfort, but from the endless pursuit of survival. In the unforgiving grip of the Ice Age, shelter was not merely a place to rest. It was the thin line between life and death. As blizzards swept across the frozen plains and winds howled like wild beasts, the cavemen understood that survival meant more than courage. It required ingenuity. Their shelters were their fortresses against the merciless cold, their sanctuaries where life could endure. Building a shelter was an art passed down through generations, a skill honed by necessity and guided by instinct. It was where the tribe gathered, where the fire burned through the endless nights, and where the fragile spark of humanity was protected from extinction. The first shelters were born from desperation and creativity. When storms rolled over the horizon, the cavemen sought safety in the embrace of nature itself. Caves offered the most reliable refuge, deep hollows carved by time, shielded from the wind and blanketed in darkness. Within these rocky walls, they built their worlds. The flicker of firelight danced on the stone, revealing markings, carvings, and handprints that told the story of their survival. But caves were not always found where they roamed, so they learned to create their own shelters, crafting homes from the very bones of the earth and beasts that walked upon it. Mammoth bones formed the frames of their dwellings, arched and bound together by sinew and hide. Over this sturdy skeleton, they layered animal skins, thick, fur-lined hides that trapped warmth and repelled snow. The result was a structure both primitive and ingenious, capable of withstanding the fierce breath of the Ice Age. Inside, they lined the ground with furs and moss, creating soft bedding that insulated against the frozen soil. Stones circled their fires, reflecting heat throughout the enclosure. The crackle of flames became the rhythm of life itself, a heartbeat echoing through every winter night. For tribes that migrated with the seasons, portable shelters became essential. They constructed simple windbreaks, walls of branches, snow, and hides that could be assembled quickly and left behind when the herd moved. These temporary refuges were often clustered together, forming miniature villages that flickered with torchlight in the dark. Each family tended its own fire, yet the warmth of the entire camp blended into one collective pulse. The sight of glowing shelters across the white landscape was more than comfort. It was proof that unity could conquer even the most merciless world. Snow, the very enemy they battled, became an unexpected ally. The cavemen discovered that compacted snow could insulate as effectively as hide. They carved shelters directly into snowbanks or built dome structures similar to what would later become known as igloos. Inside these white fortresses, the temperature could rise above freezing even while storms raged outside. The air was still, the lights soft, and the silence deep. Here, families huddled close, wrapped in furs, sharing food and stories while the wind screamed beyond their walls. Each night survived was a triumph, each dawn a miracle. The construction of shelters was not just a task for survival, but a ritual of connection. Men gathered stones and bones, women stretched hides and arranged bedding, and children fetched snow and branches. It was a collective effort that bound the tribe together. Every hand had a purpose, every voice a role. The process itself became a symbol of life's persistence. When the last piece was set and the fire lit, they sat together in a moment of reverent silence, knowing that they had built not just a home, but hope itself. Inside the shelters, life continued in rhythm with the fire's glow. Tools were crafted, clothes mended, and stories shared. The walls bore marks of their presence, paintings of hunts, stars, and spirits that guided them through the endless night. These drawings were more than art. They were prayers, memories, and lessons for those who would come after. The shelter became a world within a world, a space where warmth and imagination defied the cold and fear outside. The fire's smoke rose through small vents, carrying their dreams toward the heavens. Each shelter was a reflection of its people. Some tribes built with bone and hide, others with wood and clay when the ground thawed. Some dug pits into the earth, covering them with branches and fur to create hidden havens that resisted the wind. In forested regions, they leaned trees together in cone shapes, layering bark and moss to seal out the chill. Every material had meaning. Every design was born from observation and adaptation. The land itself taught them how to build, whispering its secrets through the frost. The making of shelter also shaped their sense of belonging. It was where families gathered, where new life began, and where the old passed into memory. It was where laughter echoed and songs were sung softly into the night. Within those fragile walls, surrounded by the storm, they found something far stronger than stone: community. The warmth that filled the shelter was not only from fire, but from unity, trust, and love. They faced the elements as one, knowing that together they could endure anything. As generations passed, these shelters evolved, laying the foundation for future homes and villages. The knowledge of construction became a legacy. The art of shaping one's environment was humanity's first step toward civilization. What began as simple survival soon became expression, each shelter a reflection of ingenuity and hope. The cavemen who once huddled beneath firs in the frozen dark unknowingly planted the seeds of human progress. When the Ice Age finally began to retreat and the earth softened under the returning sun, the shelters transformed once again. The tribes moved from bones and hides to wood and clay, from temporary huts to lasting dwellings. Yet the spirit of those early builders endured. They had faced the world's coldest age and emerged with the knowledge that survival was not just about fighting the cold. It was about creating warmth. Every shelter they built was a declaration that even in the harshest world, humanity would always find a way to live, to hope, and to endure together. Among all the shelters the cavemen built to survive the endless winters, one detail stood out: an empty spot. A small, untouched space deliberately left unoccupied, often near the fire or along the edge of the dwelling. It was not carelessness or oversight. It was intentional, almost sacred. For centuries, archaeologists puzzled over this mystery. Why would a people fighting for every scrap of warmth and safety leave any part of their hard-earned shelter unused? To understand it is to glimpse the spiritual heart of early humanity, a window into their beliefs, fears, and connection with the unseen world that shared their nights. The Ice Age was not only a battle against nature, but against the unknown. To the cavemen, the world was filled with invisible forces, spirits of the dead, guardians of the hunt, and shadows that walked between firelight and darkness. Every sound in the night carried meaning. Every flicker of flame seemed alive. In this fragile world, survival was as much about respect as it was about strength. The empty space was more than just absence, it was presence. A silent offering to the unseen, a gesture of humility before forces greater than themselves. Some anthropologists believe the empty spot was reserved for spirits, ancestors who watched over their descendants. As families gathered around the fire, eating, repairing tools, or whispering stories, that silent corner remained untouched, as if waiting for a guest who existed just beyond sight. The warmth from the fire reached it, the smoke curled over it, and the shadows of those living danced across it. To the cavemen, this was not superstition, but balance. To invite the spirits into their shelter was to ensure protection from the dangers outside, the storm, the beasts, and death itself. Others suggest it was born from fear, the fear of offending what they could not understand. The Ice Age was cruel, unpredictable, and indifferent. Entire families could vanish in the cold, and herds that once sustained life could disappear overnight. The cavemen, witnessing such devastation, sought to make peace with what they could not control. Leaving a space empty was a message to nature. We take only what we need. It was an unspoken pact with the world, a sign of restraint in an age where greed could mean death. The empty spot also carried practical wisdom disguised as ritual. In the harshest winters, air circulation was crucial. A small, clear space near the fire helped smoke escape and fresh air enter, preventing suffocation. Over time, this functional habit merged with spiritual meaning, becoming part of their identity. As myths grew and stories spread, the practical became sacred, and what began as survival turned into tradition. This merging of necessity and belief defined early humanity. Every act of survival carried meaning beyond its function. There are signs that this space became a central element in their rituals. During cold nights, when storms raged outside and the tribe huddled together, shamans, spiritual leaders, would sit near the empty space, murmuring chants to unseen forces. They believed the fire's light bridged two worlds, the living and the spirit realm. The empty spot was the threshold, a boundary not to be crossed but to be respected. Offerings of bones, carved stones, or bits of food were sometimes placed there. To modern eyes, it may seem like mere superstition, but to them, it was a gesture of gratitude, a way to share warmth with the unseen protectors who guarded them through the dark. The children were taught early never to sit in that space. They were told stories that kept their respect alive, tales of spirits who became angry when disrespected, of hunters who ignored the empty space and never returned. These myths, passed through whispers and firelight, shaped the moral codes of the tribe. They learned reverence, caution, and coexistence with forces beyond their understanding. Through this, the empty spot became not only a spiritual symbol, but a teacher, a constant reminder of the thin veil separating life and death. In many shelters discovered by archaeologists, signs of this tradition linger. An unmarked area devoid of tools, bones, or ash, clear where every other surface shows signs of human use. It's as if a deliberate pause was carved into the rhythm of life. These patterns reveal how belief guided behavior, and how spirituality became woven into survival. Even without words or written faiths, the cavemen expressed deep awareness of life's mystery. Their empty space was their first altar, their first act of prayer in a cold and merciless world. Over time, as generations passed and the Ice Age softened, this tradition evolved. Early settlements carried echoes of it. Spaces left untouched near hearths, symbolic corners reserved for ancestral spirits. It became part of a growing consciousness that life was not solitary, that even in the warmth of firelight, unseen forces shared the space. In that understanding lay the birth of ritual, religion, and the moral compass that would guide humanity for millennia. The empty spot was not just a superstition. It was philosophy in its earliest form. It represented the awareness that survival required respect for nature, for the dead, for forces unseen but deeply felt. It embodied the humility that humanity learned long before words or temples existed. Every flicker of firelight that reached that space carried the same message. We are not alone, and our survival depends on harmony, not dominance. As modern humans look back, standing in the ruins of those shelters, that untouched corner still speaks. It tells us that even at the dawn of existence, our ancestors understood something profound. That life is not just about what we occupy, but what we choose to leave untouched. In that emptiness, they found meaning. In that silence, they found peace. And in that small, sacred space left beside the fire, the first whispers of spirituality were born, echoing through time, reminding us that even in the coldest darkness, humanity has always made room for the unseen warmth of the soul.